Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Monica Alba in Washington as leaders from both parties brace for a primetime presidential address in just a few hours, with the midterms fast approaching. Many of the details of tonight's speech remain a mystery, but a source familiar with the remarks tells NBC News that the president is expected to focus in part on election security and highlight some of his administration's findings about the 2020 election, which he lost. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt, in her first briefing since returning from maternity leave, was pressed by reporters multiple times today for more details about the speech, which the president has hyped as, quote, really, really big news.
It will shock you if you have an honest eye listening to the president tonight, and everything he is saying will be backed by facts and by evidence that will be provided this evening. The president will be making a very important announcement with respect to the integrity of our elections. However, it is also very possible at the top of the speech he will mention the current situation with Iran and also the economy as well. As you all know, President Trump is a man of his own word, and he sometimes is thinking about these things up until he walks out. But we have had conversations about him addressing a range of topics, and that could very well be possible tonight.
Tonight's speech coming as the Trump administration ramps up pressure on congressional Republicans to pass a controversial election overhaul bill ahead of November's midterms. Vice President Vance meeting with House Republicans on the Hill yesterday to rally them on the issue.
The way you save America is by bringing election integrity. It's something that matters. It's a shame that the Democrats aren't going to help us get this done, given that a majority of Democrat voters actually want us to have election integrity in this country. But we've got a good piece of legislation to support the troops, support the farmers, and get Save America Act passed. This, of course, is the first step, but it's an important step. We're going to take it together.
Some Republicans clearly uneasy with the idea of a primetime presidential address on this issue of election security, when polling shows voters are more focused on affordability issues and the fallout from the war against Iran. House Speaker Mike Johnson told reporters he has not spoken with the president about tonight's address, while several Senate Republicans voiced their concerns about an address looking back on the 2020 election.
Look, we can't re-prosecute that campaign. Anytime you're looking back, you're not looking ahead, and I'm looking ahead to these elections, and the president should as well.
I think the more productive conversation would be speaking to the American people with an objective plan of how do we actually address your kitchen table issue. How do you pay your bills? I mean, my gosh, the cost of living is going up. So I try to meet people where they are, and I think that's where they are.
I think there's a lot of good news that the president can actually talk about. I think that would be constructive. Or he might want to use this time to give us a better view on what he thinks the outcome or how the way forward is going to be in Iran. I think Americans are curious about that.
Democrats from both chambers, meanwhile, pre-butting the president's address, criticizing him for sowing doubts about the results of the 2020 election that he lost, and warning Republicans could be laying the groundwork to interfere in the 2026 midterms. NBC News White House correspondent Julie Tsirkin joins me now. Also with me is NBC News Chief Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobles, as well as NBC News senior reporter Jane Timm, who covers election administration and policy for us. Thank you all for getting us started. Julie, who is actually crafting this speech, and who do we know has been actually involved in writing this, or is this something that, like with most things with this president, is really driven by him?
Monica, you hit the nail on the head. It is absolutely driven by the president. Karoline Leavitt, the press secretary, made that very clear today. And she said what we had been reporting, that the president plans to unveil some new findings. She said those findings will shock us all. When asked by our own Garrett Haake and pressed really why the president continues to put this issue so front and center, as you heard there from Democrats and Republicans saying that they wish the president just focused on the economy instead, she essentially said that you have to stay tuned because the president had not yet declassified those intelligence documents that she says that a person familiar with the speech tonight say that will show new findings of potential election irregularities, irregularities dating back to the 2020 election that we know don't exist at this point. Karoline Leavitt saying there that the president had been working with Bill Pulte, who's been in an acting position as the head of the intelligence agency, and as well as others potentially involved with this. I'm thinking of Ratcliffe, who's the head of the CIA, Kash Patel as well, who's the head of the FBI. There was some reporting Monica, earlier this week that those individuals may be in the room with the president. I had asked the White House about that, and while they are not confirming, they are also not denying. So that gives you a picture of what we could potentially see surrounding the president tonight, as he certainly makes this a focus of his remarks. Although Levitt did say today as well, the press secretary, that he could just freestyle, talking on top about Iran, about the economy, and other matters as well.
Yeah, we're just going to have to wait to see that in real time. Julie, you mentioned Bill Pulte. Let's drill down on that a little bit, because he has been the acting director of national intelligence for nearly a month now. So what do we know about what he has been doing in that role over these last 4 weeks, and whether any of his work might be featured or part of tonight's remarks?
Monica, I think the fact that the president is holding this speech tonight shows us why he wanted Pulte, who is a housing executive, has no experience in the intelligence space, why he wanted him around to lead this agency when he has someone like Jay Clayton that has bipartisan support, at least at this juncture, to be confirmed as the head of that agency after Tulsi Gabbard left. And what now we know it is because, as the president had instructed Pulte to do over the last several weeks, which is to look into declassifying some of this information surrounding the 2020 election. Also, we know that Pulte was part of a task force that was set up in the White House several weeks ago to really try and drill down on this issue. And it dates far further than that. We remember when Gabbard, Tulsi Gabbard, who of course was the former DNI, she traveled to places like Georgia, to places like Puerto Rico to try and dig into some of these issues. And Democrats are really worried about what this means. In fact, some of the Democrats, as you'll talk to Ryan about, are saying that this points to Trump looking ahead to the 2026 election, not so much the 2020 election. Monica.
And Julie, before I let you go, I have to ask you about the story that everybody is seemingly talking about. The fact that the president's longtime teleprompter operator is now being investigated for allegedly making more than $90,000 by betting on his speeches. Who is this prompter operator, Gabriel Perez, and what do we know about the investigation as it stands? Yeah,
we actually managed to dig up some photos. We think it's him, but he's so behind the scenes. He's been operating the teleprompter for the president dating back to 2016 by his side, somebody that, of course, is behind the camera. But in this case, Kalshi, the betting markets platform, reported him up to the CFTC because they noticed some unusual profits that he was making, close to $100,000, as you mentioned. The CFTC now investigating him. Caroline Levitt today said the president was disturbed by the allegations, and she said that he's on unpaid administrative leave. Whether that means he's out of the White House for good remains to be seen, but I don't think we'll be seeing him tonight. Monica?
Julie, thank you for that. Ryan, I do want to turn to you specifically. Of course, you cover Capitol Hill every day and understand this dynamic so well. So Republicans, and especially those who are on the ballot this November, what are they looking for or not looking for from the president?
I think I can confidently say that if you're a Republican in a state that could be 50-50, that's competitive in the Senate side, or a House district that is potentially in an area that could go one way or the other, you just hope the president cancels the speech tonight. It's the last thing you want him to be talking about. If you're a diehard Republican in a ruby red district, bring it on. The more you talk about election integrity or question the results of the 2020 election, the better. That feeds the president's base. But time and time again, when you talk to these Republicans, the ones that are clear-eyed about the 2026 midterms, they do not want to relitigate what happened in 2020. They want to talk about moving forward. They want to talk about gas prices. They want to talk about energy policy. They want to talk about these kitchen table issues, the price of eggs. And the more you talk about election fraud, A, it's going to make your supporters who believe it not show up to the polls, and B, it takes away from this overall message that Republicans think that they have the upper hand on.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that, because if Republicans do want to talk about affordability, I mean, inflation is still high, gas prices are going up, there are still these tensions with Iran. So is affordability actually a winning issue for the GOP right now? They feel that?
So some Republicans believe that you can make that argument, that the way the president is going about this, the different policies that they've instilled, they point to different aspects of the great big beautiful bill that provided tax cuts or extended tax cuts in some regards, that if you can single out some of these individual issues, you can point to examples of why the White House has made life easier for Americans, or even make the argument that ultimately the war in Iran will lead to lower prices down the road. It's not an easy argument to make, but it's a much safer playing ground to be having this conversation on than these fanciful claims about election fraud that in many respects don't change the outcome of an election, but could serve to suppress the very voters that you need to get to the polls.
And we mentioned that the vice president was trying to rally support around the SAVE Act or the Save America Act through potentially this reconciliation package. Can you just walk us through whether that is even realistic or where that may go from here?
There's no one more frustrated by this conversation than the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, whose responsibility it would be to shepherd this legislation through the Senate. Listen to how he talked about it this week, about how difficult it would be to get this over the finish line.
I have to be the realist, and so I'm not, like I said, I'm not poo-pooing it, but I'm just saying people need to think long and hard about what it entails when you put something like that, both through the budget resolution and a reconciliation bill, which again in the House is a simple majority exercise without the restrictions of the Byrd rule.
So people that aren't versed in Senate parliamentary procedure, at the risk of glazing your eyes over, what Republicans want to do is pass this with only 51 votes. In order to do that, it has to be something that's directly tied to the budget. So it has to involve some level of spending. So what Republicans are proposing is maybe incentivizing states to implement some of these provisions within the Save America Act. That wouldn't be the wide open, wholesale changes that the White House is looking for. So it's kind of a way to paper it over, maybe make the hardcore Republicans feel better about it, but it's not the solution that Donald Trump really wants. And I think at the end of the day could just make things a little bit more difficult for the White House as they pitch this across the country.
And not something likely that would apply to these
Certainly
midterms,
yes.
even if...
Yes. Even if they pass the Save America Act completely today, without any of these things attached to it, it would get litigated in court almost immediately and practically would not be able to be implemented by the fall election.
Really important context, Ryan Nobles. Thank you. And Jane Timm, I want to turn to you for more context. You cover this stuff really every single day. And I just want you to give us a reality check from your perch. How safe are U.S. elections right now?
Monica, the reality is that American elections are safe. Voter fraud occurs very rarely, usually in isolated circumstances. And a big part of that is that America's election system is very local. It is run by thousands of jurisdictions around the country. So to actually steal an election, sway an election, and compromise it, you would need an army of people on the ground, often in positions of power across the country, to do this. This is something that would be detected if it was attempted or there was anything more than influence. We know that foreign countries try and influence American elections, but we know that they have not been able to intervene to change the results, change the outcome of an election. That's what the broad conclusion of the American intelligence community has been since 2021, when they put out a report and said this is what happened in 2020.
I think that's really important to focus on. So just explain the distinction between other countries trying to influence, which is one thing, or intervene in our elections.
Yeah, so the influence campaigns is things like what Russia did in 2016, trying to go after President Trump. But there's a difference between influencing, casting doubt on American election systems. That's something that we know foreign countries have tried to do. But there's a difference between that and actually changing the outcome of election, changing ballots, changing voter rolls. We know that that has not occurred according to the American intelligence community. There's a big difference between sort of casting, going after Joe Biden in politics and actually changing the results.
Okay, and let's say even if a foreign actor is able to intervene in our elections, how difficult would it be to sway the outcome?
Yeah, America's elections are run on paper ballots. So what's really important is that you can always go back and check. There's a couple of states that do use digital ballots, so there are ways to look into those and audit them. There's lots of audits. There's lots of recounts in this country. And I think what's important is that despite all the things that President Trump has said and cast doubt on the 2020 election outcome, he actually chose not to pay for audits in places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan in 2020. He qualified for a recount in those places and chose not to pursue one. They would have cost him about $10 million.
$10 million. That is really important to recall. Jane Timm, thank you for staying across it all. We know you'll be busy tonight.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.